Protein food source selection. So a high quality protein source is going to be those that provide all the essential, talked about this earlier, right? 9 essential amino acids. The ones that are really high in those, we consider really high quality proteins. It's going to be more of our animal-based protein sources, and all the non-essential amino acids as well. So some of our highest quality ones are going to be meats: chicken, fish, beef, turkey, wild game. Beef is great because it does provide lots of different nutrients. Especially important, I would say, for females, any red meat, because you can get some iron source for them. Selenium, vitamin A, B12, folic acid. Creatine content's also relatively pretty high, 5 grams per 2.2 pounds. Eggs is another very viable protein source and brings about a lot of other beneficial micronutrients too. Riboflavin, selenium, vitamin K, choline, leucine, zeaxanthin. Lots of good components for health. Then we're gonna have our milk-based proteins, with whey being one of the highest biological available sources. That's ranked really high because it's really high in the essential amino acids. Also, whey brings in some other immune and lymphatic components that could have some beneficial responses: beta-lactoglobulin, alpha-lactoglobulin, lactalbumin. Let me correct my speech. Also, vitamin D and calcium too, which we chronically see. Most people don't get enough vitamin D. Usually as bodybuilders, we get plenty of calcium though. And we will have some plant-based sources, so don't think that they're all poor quality. There are some high-quality plant-based sources that are complete that are out there. And now we will get into the plant versus animal debate and why we do count trace proteins. All right, so vegan versus omnivore. So on a gram per gram basis, animal-based protein sources typically contain more leucine and essential amino acids. And this is why, in turn, we do consider them higher quality sources, as those are essential amino acids that we need and we can't produce on our own. We also know that they really drive that muscle building machinery, right? Well, whey protein contains, for one, 26% more essential amino acids than rice protein. And I picked out rice because what do we consume a lot of in the bodybuilding world? White rice. So whey does have definitely more essential amino acids, and rice is highly consumed by bodybuilders. So vegans have to be challenged with pairing proteins devoid of other macros. So if they're consuming a lot of rice, they need to pair it up with something like beans that can fill in some of those other amino acid gaps that, say, rice doesn't have. So contest prep, it can be really challenging for a strict vegan as they get into using food sources that it's hard to adjust macros on, right? If you're consuming beans, they have like some protein, they have some carbohydrate, they have a little bit of fat. Like, how do you lower carbs in a bean to only get protein, right? It can be challenging. Now, if you have like a lacto-ovo vegetarian where they can still consume dairy, they still consume fish, this isn't really a problem for them as they're able to get all the essential amino acid sources. But the strict vegan, it can be a real challenge for. Let's look at some of the studies for rice versus whey. So on this first study, resistance trained individuals, they trained them 3 days a week for 8 weeks. And there was a post-training protein group, and this is on top of a diet already consisting of 25% protein. So this is already a high protein diet to begin with. And post-workout, they would take 48 grams of whey, so this is 5.5 grams of leucine, or 48 grams of rice protein, which contains 3.8 grams of leucine. And what we see here on the left is lean body mass gain. And from a baseline from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, same amount of muscle gain across this group, for whether it was whey or whether it was rice. I know the whey looks a little higher, but that group started with a little bit higher lean body mass to begin with. This is also changes in quadricep thickness. And again, significant difference from baseline, but no significant difference between groups. We have another study looking at nearly the same thing. Resistance trained 4 days a week across 10 weeks, but they changed the total protein amount they did, but they changed the distribution. So they did 24 grams of rice protein, which is only 2.1 grams of leucine. So it's actually getting a little bit lower on what we know is like the threshold to drive protein synthesis, versus whey, which is 2.5 grams of leucine. And they have that post-workout, or on non-trained days, they would have it pre-bed. So every day they were consuming this small amount of protein contribution. There were similar changes between groups. Both increased 1 kilogram of lean mass. They were measuring via DEXA, so it was a higher quality measurement. The total protein intake for these groups was 1.87 grams per kilogram, and they were consuming 34 kcal per kilogram per day. Why I noted that is because it's important, because they had sufficient amount of calories, which that is about a little bit more of a surplus. Nothing too vast though. They went beyond that 1.6 gram per kilogram that we know is kind of that minimum or average amount that we know drives protein synthesis. But even despite whether it was whey or rice, the same outcome happened. Now we can also look at soy protein and versus whey. And in this study, it was vegan versus omnivore, right? 12 weeks, the resistance trained consumed 1.6 gram per kilogram protein and supplemented with soy or whey protein. And there was similar changes in leg lean mass. And also just to note, soy likely does not alter male hormone levels significantly. If you want to read further into that, I recommend looking up Hamilton Reeves' study in 2010. I have it referenced at the end of this lecture. But if we looked at this study for leg lean mass across it from pre to post, we still see that there is a significant difference from pre to post, but not significant between groups, whether you're vegetarian or you're doing more of this omnivore diet with supplementing with soy versus whey. Now, one last thing we'll look at was pea protein. And pea protein is a little bit more unique because it actually is one of the complete vegetable vegan sources of protein. So in this 12-week study, 161 trained males for 12 weeks, we don't know what the total daily protein intake was. I couldn't find it in the study. But they were supplementing with 50 grams of pea protein, just 6.4 grams of leucine versus 50 grams of whey isolate. And there was no difference in bicep thickness between the groups. So we have some takeaways here that we're going to get into a minute. But what I wanted to bring up was this table of different compositions and what was recommended for if you were to design a vegan protein that would be complete and very comparable to whey. And I think this gives something good if you do have someone you're working with that is vegan or even lacto-ovo vegetarian, is that you could go to truenutrition.com or some of these other nutrition sites that allow you to make custom blends. And you could do a 70% pea protein blend with 30% rice protein, and you'd have a very similar protein amino acid composition as whey. So if we looked at leucine, 8.8 grams versus 8.6 grams, isoleucine, 4.1 versus 4.6 grams. So it's extremely comparable. So that would be my recommendation, to do some type of blend like that, or find one would be easy to do as well. So the vegan takeaways and recommendations around this is, as we're increasing total protein intake was adequate, the protein quality of an individual meal is of much less concern. So even if you had a meal that was just 50 grams of protein from rice, if the total protein intake for the day is sufficient, it doesn't matter for the outcome. And this is what we saw. This was pulled from one of the studies, is that this leucine content, once total protein intake gets high enough, there's just no further benefit that it really matters where the source is coming from. So as the protein intake gets higher, the lower leucine content is just of no importance. And that is the big argument around rice protein that's real low in leucine. But what we see here throughout these studies is that as long as total protein intake is sufficient, it doesn't matter. Now, a complementary protein need not be consumed even if the same meal, but within a 24-hour period. So even for the person where, like we were talking about, we had to pair proteins up, like rice and beans together, as long as the total protein intake for the day is correct, it might not matter. So that aspect around protein distribution and how a meal could take like 10 hours to fully digest and all amino acids are trickling in, well, we have that overlap occurring. And that's kind of why that really won't matter. Then also with resistance training, right? We know protein synthesis is elevated for 24 hours after a session. So with this huge anabolic window of a day or more, as long as we get enough total amino acids in that window, we're sufficiently covered. So recommendations around contest prep for a vegan is vegans should really leverage protein powders. Now, I know it could be a hunger issue, but that's how you're going to make sure you do get complete protein sources. As the strict vegan, that might be more of a challenge for. I would recommend a pea rice protein-based supplement, and a few things that are hard for a vegan to get. I would recommend supplementing with L-carnitine, preferably injectable form if you are on the enhancement side. If not, oral would be fine. Creatine, beta-alanine would be those other ones to utilize. Other things to know for the vegan takeaway is counting methods. So count all trace protein, as they all contribute towards hypertrophy outcomes and kcal totals, right? They're not calorie free. And we know that rice protein matters in driving the protein synthesis response. So to say it doesn't matter, we don't need to count it, that's not what evidence-based is showing us for practice. That we should be counting all these protein grams no matter what the source they're coming from. So counting methods can be based on direct macronutrients if foods are not changing on a day-to-day basis. So if you have some people that are programming around, hey, I do only count direct sources, that can be fine. But that's usually if foods aren't changing throughout the day, or by the week, then they're always kind of accounted for in that sense. If you're using someone where they're using more macro counting, the food sources are always changing, that's where it could definitely become more problematic as protein increases are going up and down. The caveat around that is once the situation where you get in the bodybuilder in the off season on really high protein intakes where you wouldn't know because you're not counting the indirect sources. But I would want to ensure that at least 50% of protein are coming from high quality sources, just to make sure we do check that box and we never go below this threshold to where if you were to have a bodybuilder and lowering down protein intake, that at least half that protein in every meal is coming from some type of high protein source, high quality protein source. So I want to give you an example of this trace protein calculation. And what we see is like a typical 250 pound bodybuilder, because those are walking around everywhere, consuming a protein intake of 1.36 grams per pound of body weight. So falls within our range. 6 meals per day. We have them high calorie in the off season, 5,000 calories. This ends up being 340 grams of protein, 735 grams of carbs, 92 grams of fat. So if I counted up and I programmed this all in a Cronometer for this diet, and for direct protein sources, this was with eggs, beef, whey, and chicken, it was 227 grams of direct protein. From trace protein, 114 grams from nut butter, white rice, oats, cream of rice, berries, veggies, bagels, all those items. So you're looking at about 1/3 of the protein coming from trace protein. So if you weren't counting for this, and you said, I'm only going to program 340 grams of direct protein sources, to increase that by 30%, you're now looking at someone that's consuming 470 grams of protein per day. Could be extremely excessive to where there could have those issues where in that study with Antonio using 2 grams per pound of body weight, the guys had such a hard time getting the food down. They're always full. There's lots of GI bloating and distress that the subjects were complaining of. So you can have someone in the off-season that is reaching a bottleneck with digestion problems, not able to get their calorie surplus in because they're over-consuming protein, when very well we could take that protein, lower it, and put it into carbohydrates or fats and make that diet much more manageable. So I did this to really show you what a large contribution trace protein can make. Then also you just have the calories that you're not even accounting for. So that could be 500 calories that you're not adjusting for. And I've seen meal plans where someone's only counting direct sources, even from like say a bagel. I don't count the protein in a bagel. Well, there's 8 to 10 grams of protein in one bagel. So I've seen off seasons where someone like pulls out the rice and we'll have 2 bagels for this meal. That's like 20 grams of protein you just added in that you didn't even count for. So things to consider. So I would count all trace proteins is the takeaway, and why I just showed you all of those studies around rice protein absolutely builds muscle and why we should account for all of it. Now, I already broke down also the easy math. Start a prep, 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. It's going to lower down as you pull down carbs and fats. Off season, start them on the lower end, and that's going to increase. And then at some point, if food gets too high, we can always pull down some direct protein sources and add back in carbs and fats. Same thing goes for prep.